data science can be applied to public policy research. So basically, my interest in talking about this comes from my own personal experiences. A little bit about me. My name is Bhargavi. I've spent much of my career thinking about how data science methods can be used to improve public policy research. So what that means is basically I did my undergraduate degree in economics at New York University. I thought, oh, this is really interesting. I can think about how certain, decisions impact people and households. And I was really interested in thinking about like the things that were happening in the world and how they would impact people. And then I realized, oh, there's this whole field of public policy that focuses on sort of how governments can protect people and what tools we can use to analyze and assess whether policies are actually working for people. So I thought, oh, that's really cool. So maybe I should go do that. And so I started my career working at the Urban Institute, which is a research organization in DC, and they focus on public policy research as well. And it was very interesting. I focused on housing policy. And then after that, I realized, well, a lot of the work we're doing here requires data, and we're using data to understand whether policies work or not. So maybe I should learn a little bit more about data science and new methods to analyze data. So I went on to do my master's at University of Chicago, and it was a joint degree in data science and public policy. So much of my presentation today is just going to be a mixture of things I've done in my graduate work, things I've done in my work experiences. I've also worked for a couple of government organizations and nonprofits. So I think there's a wide breadth of things that I've done, and I'm excited to sort of talk about it and answer any questions that you might have on this area of research. So what is public policy research? Does anyone sort of want to type in the chat if you have an idea of what it might be? And just quick question for you all. If I look at my chat, is that distracting? Like, is there a gray box that shows up or not?
That's just your slides, so you're good to go.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. All right. So anyone in the chat for public policy? That's all right if you don't know. It is kind of a small area of research, so I understand if you haven't encountered it yet. But basically, it can mean a lot of different things. I've specifically focused on 3 parts of this area. So evaluating or understanding the impact of government policies or initiatives, improving and filling gaps in existing data sets, and then improving citizen access to government programs. So I'll go through each of these in more detail in my presentation. So yeah, the first big idea I wanted to introduce is evidence-based policymaking. So it's the idea that, data should drive a government's policy decisions. So for example, if we're trying to decide whether we should invest more money into a program, we should probably know whether that program is working well in the way that it is, or maybe we need to redesign the program so that it's better suited to the needs of the people. So a lot of what we could do is we use data to try to understand whether the policies that we have in place are actually doing the things that we want, or if there's unintended things that are happening as a result of our policies. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples that I've worked in that I thought might be interesting. So one of the projects I've worked on is predicting childhood asthma prevalence. So basically there's an organization, or it's a government agency called HUD, which they focus on housing in the United States. And their goal is to make sure that there's housing is available and affordable, and there's some government programs that offer subsidized housing to people based on their financial need. And so what this project undertook was is this housing that's being provided actually safe, and are there potential issues where asthma is more prevalent in certain types of housing, and how should we sort of understand that? And so what we did here is we used logistic regression, which to see or predict as childhood asthma prevalence based on certain housing characteristics. So that should look somewhat familiar to you. Logistic regression is used a lot to understand these types of questions. And I thought this chart might be useful to understand sort of what we found. And we found that, renters tended to experience more asthma triggers than owners. And so this, chart shows that exposure to smoke or musty smells or mold, which we typically think are related to experiencing childhood asthma, they tend to be pretty high in renter households compared to owner households. So this was useful for the agency that we were interested in providing this to, because they were able to see that, oh, maybe we need to invest more into mitigation efforts to make sure that asthma prevalence is less in our rental houses or renter owner properties. So that is what we were sort of trying to tell them is, try to invest more into your rental properties. So that was one example. And then another example that I worked on, which is, really important in this current environment, is that there's a lot of old, provisions that were put in place that said that if you were of a certain racial group, that you could not access housing. And there was a big movement towards removing these. So then there was a policy called the Fair Housing Act. And that was a policy that was put in place to make sure that, access to housing is fair. But really, there's a lot of evidence showing that there's very explicit discrimination, racial, and it had impacts on racial segregation in a lot of cities. And one of those cities is Philadelphia. And so previously we couldn't really do research on this as much because all the evidence was in the form of typewritten PDFs. So this is where data science or machine learning methods came in, and we used NLP and a software called OCR to take the PDFs and convert them into words that we could actually analyze and see, like, how often it was very explicitly said that, oh, only certain people can access this housing. So these are a couple of examples of that. So, it literally says here, like, you cannot access it. People of African or Semitic race, which is an old term, like, cannot access this housing. And it's really striking. There's an entire mapping prejudice project that you can check out later if you're interested in seeing more about this. But the point of doing this research is we want to understand, like, what are the long-term effects of the fact that we did not have policies protecting people in racial groups who could not access housing. And then there are a couple of other examples that you can check out. So evictions are issues where people are told that they have to leave their housing because they haven't paid their rent. And some areas are more likely to tell their residents that they have to leave than others. And it could be because they owe as little as, like, I don't know, like $20. And so this is kind of an important issue as well. And that's another case where another organization took PDFs and legal documents and turned them into data to analyze trends in what was going on in evictions across the country. And another example, like, quickly here, is just flood risk. If you wanted to see the impact of natural disasters on different groups or different parts of the US, then you could also think about how government programs could be better at serving areas that are more often flooded or in higher flood risk zones. So these are just a couple of examples here. So anyone have any questions so far on what I've I've shared. Okay, but so now that we've seen all those examples, we can see that the data, it's not always perfect. And you've probably also seen that in your own work on your project so far, is there are always issues in the data and gaps and things that we can't necessarily understand from data alone. And that's something that I found as well. So this is a part of, social science research. We often use surveys as a way of understanding what happened. And so can anyone put in the chat what some issues are with surveys? Do we think that they're representative of everybody, and what are some issues that come up with surveys? I see response bias. Yeah, possibility of dishonest responses. Definitely dishonest answers, limited scope. Not everyone has access, right? Does not represent the entire population. No guarantee that people respond with the truth. Yeah, these are great. This is exactly right. So like when you have surveys and you're trying to do research to understand what the impacts of certain programs are on people, it's like, we don't really know if we're going to get a representative sample of every person in that population. And yeah, it says here, someone said only certain groups of people answer. There's multiple choice. You might not get the answer you're looking for, right? There's tons of issues with surveys. And a really big one actually is that a lot of people just don't respond. You can imagine there's a lot of cases where it's really hard to get people to respond to surveys for a lot of different reasons. And I even think of myself, it's not like I have always answered every survey I've been asked to answer in my lifetime. So you can see that there's certainly a lot of problems with that. But despite those challenges, that's often the only data that we used to have to be able to understand policy. So that's what we used to use. But nowadays, there's some movement toward maybe using other methods, like in data science, to improve survey responses or like get more out of them and deal with issues like a non-response bias and issues of samples not being representative. So one example of this that I've worked on before is using Bayesian networks. Basically, the way to explain it is there's a Python package called Doppelganger, and it basically finds patterns in the data and uses those patterns to understand what the data should look like if it is representative of the population. And it helps come up with those weights to reweight the survey data in a way that is more representative of the general population. So weighting is not a new concept. All surveys at this point in time, when people do research with surveys, they do the reweighting. What's different about Bayesian networks and this machine learning approach is that we're actually like understanding the weights more from the data rather than sort of coming up with it on our own. And there's pros and cons to this, but this is just sort of a new area of research that I've had the opportunity to sort of explore and see whether that could improve issues of survey non-response bias. And the other one that I've looked into is, could we potentially use other data, maybe like Twitter data, to supplement surveys so that we get more of a picture of what's out there? So what people think rather. So if you look at the process that I went through, essentially what I did is we downloaded the tweets using get old tweets package. It's a Python package. And this was for the issue of and the environment and climate change. So we wanted to search for the hashtag environment, do some data pre-processing, which you've definitely seen in your NLP part of this workshop. And so that was, removing the words that we didn't need, and then tokenizing the words and all that. And then we use a method called topic modeling, which just basically finds the most important topics or words that are like have clusters of other words around them. And that was one approach that we used. And then for the hashtag of climate change, we did the data pre-processing again, and we did sentiment analysis similar to the Yelp example that you've seen before to see what people sentiments were in the tweets with certain words like climate change. And then we tried to compare our Twitter data with survey results. So, using the most common topics that came up in LDA topic modeling, we compared those to the most common responses to a survey question, like, what do you think is the most important environmental issue to focus on? And then we compared sentiments of tweets to survey questions that were more open-ended, like on a scale of 1 to 5, how dire do you think the issue of climate change is? Of course, this was not a perfect comparison because for many, many reasons. I mean, it's really hard to compare what you get out of Twitter to a survey response. For one, survey responses are pretty, like you need to answer like one of many multiple choice possibilities, which we can't necessarily capture in Twitter. I mean, Twitter, you could really write about anything. So it was a very imperfect comparison, but the idea was like, is there something that we can glean from Twitter that we don't have in the surveys? And we sort of felt like maybe that is possible. And so what I really wanted to ask though is, what are some issues with Twitter data? So like, does Twitter even represent public opinion? What do you think? Just type in the chat what you think about that. Do you think Twitter actually represents a population as well? Or what are some issues that might arise there? Yeah, so not everyone has a Twitter account. Those who can't access Twitter will not be represented. Yeah, only the loudest voices. Exactly, that's a big one. People might say what they don't believe in order to fit in. Yeah, maybe there's a lot of like, I guess, crowds that form in Twitter of people who want to be in the same circles, not credible. Okay, social pressure, responses aren't anonymous. Yeah, and so this is a really big one. Twitter represents a demographic that isn't necessarily the entire community. Yeah, so these are great responses. That's exactly what we also highlighted in our work. And a Pew study, Pew is an organization that does policy research as well, and they noted that approximately 10% of Twitter users in their sample were responsible for 80% of the tweets produced. So this idea of the loudest voices in the room being amplified is a really big issue with using Twitter data. And so it suggests that Twitter might not always be an accurate proxy of public opinion. But there might be some uses to just augmenting what we have with survey data with some other information from Twitter data if we think that the population that we're looking at is likely to be on Twitter or have access to it. So there's other examples of like trying to improve data sets or add to them in some way. So this is an example of some colleagues I knew who were working on synthetic tax data to protect privacy. So the IRS is the organization that has all the tax data in the US, and it's pretty rare that you get access to it, but if you have access to the public use file, they give you a file that is for the public. Then what researchers do is they try to get information about people and then connect that information to policy and see what the outcomes are of certain policies, now that they have like person level data. But there is an issue there, right? Like you might be able to easily identify from this data like an individual person, and that is not necessarily a good thing from a privacy perspective. So there have been initiatives to create synthetic data to make sure that we protect people's privacy, particularly because tax data tends to be really personal and include income and statistics about people that they may not necessarily want out there. So finally, I wanted to just touch on this idea of how can we use technology to improve access to government programs? So I went from talking about, okay, public policy research is about evaluating past policies and see how they work for us. And then maybe the data isn't that perfect. So there's some ways that we can, use data science to improve the data sets themselves. And then, the third part of this that I found interesting was, well, what if we wanted to use technology to just improve access to government programs in general? And this is an emerging area, and it's actually been around for a long time too, the idea of civic tech. It's used in a lot of countries where, individuals have put together like tech solutions to make sure that their citizens can more easily access government programs. So, one example of this that I've worked on is I used a web scraper. So this is sort of something that you can make yourself to get information from a website. Just to be clear though, you can't always do it because there are laws saying that certain websites you shouldn't scrape. So you should always be careful to make sure it's okay with them before doing it. But what we did was we web scraped from the Chicago Housing Authority website, and we knew that their website was showing people like where they could find affordable housing, but it wasn't very comprehensive and it was kind of a confusing site. So we felt like it might be better to create more of an advanced search tool that empowers people to find what neighborhood they want to live in, within what mile radius, and all this information, and then get back potential affordable housing options with indicators for whether housing vouchers are applicable. So, people get vouchers for housing, but not all landlords let them use those. So we wanted to provide more information to individuals to empower them. And then we also included more information like walk score and these other characteristics so that people can see, like, is this a place that I really want to live? Um, there are other examples of this being done in a way that's even better. So there's Fix My Street, which I saw as one example. This is the site for reporting problems in the UK. And basically you can see some examples here, but there's some issues. So like they're trying to point out some issues on their streets of things that need to be fixed. And this is a way of like sort of notifying local authorities about problems that they think haven't been addressed yet. So that's kind of the end of my talk here. I just wanted to give an overview. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to contact me at my email address here. And thanks so much for listening to me talk today.